I am going to talk about revolutionary organization, and on my talk, surprisingly, I do not have one mention of Lenin, um, which is maybe a first. Um, so I would just want to start off by saying, um, a few weeks ago, I got together for dinner with a couple longtime comrades. These are close friends that I used to organize with together in the International Socialist Organization. And we spent many years fighting in movements. But since that organization's collapse, even as they've stayed sharply revolutionary, they've shied away from joining another revolutionary organization. At one point in the night, one of them asked me point blank, "What's the use of building a revolutionary cadre organization today?" And that's a really good starting point for my talk because that's what we're trying to do, build a cadre. That is, grow and develop layers of revolutionary activists who are steeped in both the theory and the practice of Marxism. We need people who can act independently, earn and provide leadership in the struggle, and win others to Marxist organization. Repeating my good friend's question, though, why bother? What's the use of that? I'll answer you now in the same way that I answered him then with a story. In spring of 2023, the then Boston Revolutionary Socialists were growing. We had gone from 2 to around 10 members, largely but not only based around Salem State University. A lot of these new comrades had the fire to want to tear the head off the system. Some of them had read a bit of theory and history, and with one or two, much more than a bit. But I was the only active member at the time who had real experience in the revolutionary movement. I had been involved in the Occupy movement, labor solidarity organizing, multiple waves of Black Lives Matter struggle, Palestine marches against Israel's previous massacres of Gaza. I had recruited and trained revolutionaries before, had engaged in debates, had fought in and outside my organization to advance the class struggle. Each time I had learned firsthand both what it meant to be operating with others in a revolutionary group inside a broader movement and the dangers and pitfalls past movements and former comrades had fallen into. Being that solitary, experienced revolutionary in our new group, though, I was also the only person who could train these young comrades. When the far right began assaulting drag story hours in libraries up and down Massachusetts, the BRS knew we had to act. At a meeting at a queer youth center in Salem, an invitation we got thanks to one of these young comrades, we made the case to form the North Shore Trans Defense Network, a name that I had come up with. When the far right decided to come to Danvers, just a town over, we organized and mobilized a mass counter demonstration. We brought out hundreds of people, and the Fash were too scared to even show up, though we did spot them from afar. We won a major victory, but I was flat out and stretched thin between trying to train our growing group of young communists and helping to grow this incredibly vital anti-fascist united front. So I tapped a young comrade to join the Defense Network's new coordinating committee. I, on the other hand, focused on trying to hold our group together. But soon after our win, the other organizers in the network fell into a bit of security paranoia. Afraid of infiltration and doxing, they refused to call any open organizing meeting, making all decisions amongst a small group of them themselves. I didn't have the capacity to support the young comrade who I had suggested to take on relating to the network. The other organizers, in the meantime, retreated into passivity and the security culture. And since then, what began as a promising network for organizing anti-fascist activity and the defense of queer folks in the area has devolved essentially into a rump social media page with zero actions or meetings. Whenever I think back to this time, I think to myself, what if my old friends had been there with me? What if they could have brought their experience to bear and supported developing these young comrades? What if we had a bigger revolutionary cadre? That in microcosm is the argument, both the one I made to my old comrades that night and the one I'm making to you now. On every front of struggle, there are questions of strategy and tactics. There are countless pitfalls. If we're not careful, movements can get swallowed by the Democratic Party, shrink into paranoia and irrelevance, isolate themselves through extreme adventures, get crushed under state repression. All of these and more have happened before. A common phrase in describing a revolutionary socialist party is that it is the memory of the class. The institution and really the people trained and organized into it bring to bear their individual and collective experience to try and keep our side, the mass of workers with the power and interest to overthrow the system, from making the same mistakes over and over and over again. We keep the memory of past struggles, so next time we might actually win a new world, or at the very least, take a lasting step forward. The conditions for struggle are ever present. Capitalism's violence, its creation of both misery and a class that has the power to fight, are all automatic. Victory for our side, however, is not. What we do, the tools our class has on our side, the ideas and history and experience behind us, all that matters. We need experienced revolutionary activists trained in politics in every locale and in every struggle to win our fellow fighters to revolutionary conclusions and to win the struggles we're engaged in today. That's the project of Firebrand. Right now, though, the left is fragmented and weak. Honestly, it's probably weaker today than it was when I first became a revolutionary. Paradoxically, this is true in spite of many, many more people verbally interested in revolution than a decade ago. So why is that? I want to argue it's a question of politics and organization. For most of the past 40 years, the revolutionary left was dominated by little gangs all running around declaring themselves the revolutionary party. In some respects, they trained thousands of socialists, including myself, as I said before. But the political context and inherited methods of organizing combined to block the jump from small groups of 1,000 or so into a much larger revolutionary working class party. You can read my articles on this in firebrand.red for more detail, but the shorthand hot take is this. As the revolutionary socialist movement got more and more isolated from the working class, the class on which this left is based, it got disfigured. The political winds kept moving to the right. The working class more and more accepted its position in life, and our ancestors tried desperately to hold on to those politics. Second, our ancestors learned and passed down a twisted theory of organization. From their experience in big tent parties in the early 20th century, our elders learned and passed down how to use the bureaucracy to fight for and hold on to leadership. From the degenerating Communist International in the 1920s, led by revolutionaries turned bureaucrats like Zinoviev and Stalin, they learned wrongly a mistaken form of Leninism that said that a revolutionary party had to be monolithic. All in all, that added up to the politics, the leadership, and the organization being seen as inseparable from one another. And to protect it, these leaderships acted as what I call faction gangs. Instead of earning the loyalty of the membership of their groups and keeping it, they used their control of the apparatus to guarantee that loyalty. If something in the organization or outside the organization threatened that apparatus, even including an accusation of sexual assault, the leadership did everything to protect said apparatus. Principled be damned. I'll get a little bit more into our experience in the ISO a little more later, but these faction gangs are still around in different forms. We see the International Marxist Tendency now renamed the Revolutionary Communists of America, and the Communist Party USA use these methods to kick out people, clamp down on democracy, and protect their organization and leaders. The RCA group in Canada mishandled cases of sexual abuse and transphobia and kicked out the dissenters to protect its leaders. It has held on to, quote unquote, its tradition so tightly that it even pushes its main leader's view on the Big Bang onto the rest of the organization. The CPUSA faction gang, meanwhile, has blocked many attempts by members, including a recent petition and open letter campaign, to get the group to shift away from its full-throated support for the Democrats. We also see the Party for Socialism and Liberation, Freedom's Road Socialist Organization, and to a certain extent, Socialist Alternative, take these faction gang methods into every movement they're involved in. They set up front groups and use bureaucratic methods to make themselves leaders, not only in their organization, but also in the movement as a whole. Instead of creating a cadre of independent thinking Marxists that can earn leadership and convince others and struggle, these organizations train dogmatists and managers. But as struggle has picked up, as more people have entered these organizations and tried to use them to fight, these groups have also gone through crises. Some, like Socialist Alternative, have gone through multiple splits in recent years. Every so often, you hear of another group of ex-PSL members writing an open letter against the group. And others, like the ISO, which I was a part of for almost 10 years, have simply collapsed. Then there are those who, whether they have been in these groups or only brushed up against them, have rejected this faction gang model. But the alternatives they propose aren't any solution either. On the one hand, you have the big tent groups. The Democratic Socialists of America is the major one today, but not the only example we've seen. The Marxist Center from close to 10 years ago, Solidarity since the 1980s, the various iterations of the Socialist Party in the decades before that. These folks see the need for a mass socialist movement. They see the faction gangs as no way forward. But their solution is to have the left all get together, ignore all our differences, sing kumbaya, and get along. The result in reality isn't any more effective. Politics get reduced to the lowest common denominator. When differences between reformists and revolutionaries, or Stalinists, Maoists, anarchists, and Trotskyists, or even different Trotskyists get papered over, you can only take positions you can all agree on. In many cases, those positions might be the most general or under-controversial opinions. Socialism is good, but what that means isn't defined. We support Palestine or Black Lives Matter, but we can't take a firm position on the most effective strategy for the movement. Just show up and support. Or the only thing we can all agree on is doing mutual aid. Other times, these positions can simply tail the most right-wing sections of the class or the organization. We may really think we need to break from the Democrats, but most of our members and our broader audience doesn't, so let's keep calling for a vote for Kapmala, and someday we'll build a party. Second, because the organization is trying to hold together a bunch of divergent, different positions, the openings for real democratic control in a big tent are actually much smaller. The leadership needs to protect the organization and its gains, regardless of what positions were voted on at previous conventions. We saw this with the Jamal Bowman affair a couple of years ago, where DSA leadership allowed Democratic Representative Bowman, someone who toured Israel and voted for arms shipments, to stay in DSA despite the organization committed to the principles of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. When the left in DSA organized to try to kick Bowman out and follow through on that convention resolution, the leadership stripped the left of their membership and their working group. Ironically, in trying to hold together a broad tent, ends up recreating the whole faction gang process all over again, as the left again wrongly learns that controlling the apparatus is the key question. Returning to my earlier point, the faction fights in the Mass Socialist Party of America in the 1910s are what laid the basis for the monolithic parties we saw in the 1930s and still see today. At some point, we know as Firebrand, various forces of the left beyond ourselves will have to come together to build a real revolutionary party. As Firebrand, we have tried recruitment projects like the Revolutionary Socialist Network. We will try them again. But the basis of that recruitment will come from political clarity and shared struggle, not by papering over differences. It doesn't matter if parts of the Big Tent seem better than others. It doesn't matter if some different locals or working groups of DSA are more left-wing than others. The model itself can't offer a way forward due to how the relationship between the class, politics, and leadership gets expressed. In rejecting both faction gangs and big tents, some young comrades have tried to go their own way. They've tried setting up local collectives that are principled and democratic, or have even started to link these mini groups together. Their efforts are admirable, but I want to return to my story at the beginning. There are many pitfalls, not only for broad movements, but also small revolutionary organizations. Even myself, as a communist with over a decade of experience, I know I have made plenty of mistakes trying to build a local group in Boston. Those pitfalls can be both in how to organize, but also the ideas you're organized around. Just as with the big tents, politics and principle matter a great deal. So, what have we seen time and time again with these local collectives? They pop up, they exist for a few months or even a couple of years, and then they fall apart. It's really tough to train yourself, grow your group, and stay relevant with the movement when you're only a handful of inexperienced comrades stuck out in the political wilderness. So long as these collectives remain on their own, disconnected from one another, and without clear politics guiding them, they will remain part of the unfortunate and frustrating life cycle of the revolutionary left. Another part of the churn and revolving door of young communists who enter the struggle with fire in their hearts and soon fall away into activity and despair. So, what's the way forward? After the collapse of the ISO, many of my former comrades reached the conclusion that building any small group was a dead end. The trauma of the sexual assault cover up, the frustration of the collapse, the humiliation from faction gang methods, all of these and more led people to either outright step back from revolutionary organization, as my friends did, or as others did so in practice through though couched in radical phrases. This is where the myth of the microsect took hold. People in Tempest talk about building infrastructures of dissent instead of fighting for a revolutionary party. Folks talk about the struggle itself driving revolutionary conclusions. And even formations like Tempest, fearing a repeat of the past, can refuse to enforce clear and uncompromising positions on, say, voting for Kamala Harris for president or Brandon Johnson for Chicago mayor. For us in Firebrand, we have no illusions that we're the revolutionary party in embryo. We only believe that building small organizations with clear principles are a precursor to building larger ones. From little things, big things grow. It's one thing to want to get rid of capitalism, but politics is not a question of desire, it's a question of power. And the only way we can really build our power is with numbers, actual human material grounded in sharp analysis and past experience. That's what we mean by building revolutionary organization, a revolutionary cadre today. And that's what's needed now more than ever.
I highly doubt that anyone in this room isn't painfully aware of the current and ongoing catastrophe that has beset the left in the US for decades. The chaotic ineffectiveness that is the revolutionary left in the US centers around organization. This problem was not solved by the ISO, nor has it been solved in the post-ISO period. I don't bring up the ISO so quickly as to use it as a pole of circulation, which all of the class forces have revolved around. That would be ridiculous. But I do bring up the ISO because A, most of the people here were in the ISO, and B, we should not be shunning our own political history to appear as if we are not reacting to it, because we are. This is our tradition, our history, and we should be the ones to understand it, to glean the necessary lessons to move forward. I don't speak in a positive or negative tone to the legacy of the ISO, but merely with an accurate understanding, desperate need to learn from its organizational history, lest we repeat it. In this talk, I'll be proposing facets of a revolutionary socialist organization in the here and now. The question of a party is, of course, the logical extension of today's topic. For now, I will do my best to leave that discussion as a task for the future, or for the discussion. In doing so, I would like to focus on dynamics that hold the logical potential to evolve into an idea of a developing embryo of the Workers' Revolutionary Party. What are the organizational tasks that we as revolutionaries must engage in the here and now that create a rich soil from which to grow a revolutionary party from? We must not mistake the tasks of the class with the tasks of revolutionaries now. I'm going to do my best not to dig myself into too deep a theoretical hole that Reed or Steve has to bail me out of. But if I do, then I'm sure comrades better trained than I will be here. I'd like to propose 5 key characteristics of a revolutionary organization for today. I believe that these characteristics are easily duplicated for any local and are appropriate for any sized organization, even an individual socialist. Most importantly, these characteristics aren't merely descriptors. These characteristics serve as guiding principles for the trajectory of development, excuse me, for a revolutionary organization that can be of liberatory service to the working class. Revolutionary organizations must. The first one is radical democracy. Revolutionary organizations must implement democracy as a rule, both in their internal functions and their participation in movements. Fighting for democratic practices within our movements should be a key contribution from a revolutionary organization. We have seen firsthand in Denver the disastrous results when a coalition refuses to participate. Sorry, I lost my place. When it refuses to participate democratically with members. Anti-democratic practice can tear a movement apart, but this is not the worst effect. Democracy's value isn't merely equality. Democracy is the main line for the synthesis of experience that fuels growth in a socialist direction. Without democracy, an organization is robbed of its primary function of growth. A top-down organization might expand numerically. They might tag some small local victories, but they can never hope to make legitimate gains for the class because they sit above and away from the interests of members. Socialism is only achieved for the working masses by the working masses. For this, democracy is indispensable. Revolutionary organizations must begin this practice today. One of the mistakes of the ISO was that it didn't take seriously its function of democracy, resulting in a top-down organization that members were disconnected from and actively dissuaded from critiquing and growing in. The practice of from critiquing and through critiquing growing in. The practice of democracy is most consistently seen in educational, open discussions, a place where disagreements can be had, ideas circulated, and placed into a process of synthesis that strengthens each individual as well as the entire organization. We should continue to fight for open discussion in all of our meetings, especially discussion around a revolutionary Marxist program. Having open, public-facing meetings cannot be substituted in the development of a revolutionary organization. The intellectual synthesis of the proletarian social experience is a group project. From discussion as a practice of democracy is born the development of cadre, Marxist activists trained in struggle. Discussion is the first location for developing the interventionist skill set. We learn to intervene in our organizations so that we can then sharpen our presence in coalition and movement intervention. This process begins with radical democracy. And the second characteristic I had was class independence, vulgar. Fuck the Democrats. The joke of a democracy that American imperialism insists on calling itself is a lie. There is no victory for the working masses between the warring bastard brothers of Democrats and Republicans. We oppose bourgeois democracy as well as the electoral road to socialism that has led so many into a confusing swamp. There is no material difference for working class people between Democrats and Republicans. Researched, modeled, statisticized. I never read that word out loud. Statisticized and proven time and time again. This is a fact. Our organization shouldn't just be independent of Democrats. They should curse them, revile them, and insult them at every turn. Vulgarity in our opposition to Democrats is key and should rival our vulgarity towards imperialist appendage. Stand as high as possible, as loudly as possible, and muster as much bile towards these monsters for what they've done. We hate transphobic fascism. We hate the genocidal state of Israel, but we also hate Bernie Sanders more for drawing tens of thousands of activists, of would-be Marxists, into a swamp that they may not emerge from. The betrayal of AOC, Jamal Bowman, and Brandon Johnson, and any other Democrat should be held on equal footing as the ongoing genocide in Gaza, funded by the exact same organization. They are one and the same beast. It is criminally insufficient to call for voting third party or only rejecting lesser evilism when it's a bad Democrat. No qualifier is needed. It should be a crime to disorient the masses with an analysis that blurs the line between Democrat and socialist. To say that there is a categorical difference between Democratic mayoral candidates is criminal. Oh gosh, I got confused. We don't couch our organizational perspective, excuse me, in the abstract moralisms that so easily fly around socialist circles. Although one could quickly describe reformist currents as impatient for having lost faith in the actuality of revolution, the tradition of revolutionary analysis looks to the overwhelming material shortcomings of democratic opportunism. Let us be clear, voting for Democrats is never a victory for the working class. While an electoral campaign for a wolf in sheep's clothing is understandably enticing, the short-term game offered by Bernie Sanders and the like is a farce. They will not save workers. They will not help workers. They will not advance the working class movement, and they should not be trusted. Nor should we confuse our interests with theirs. Any form of propaganda that does not clearly point to the necessity of this distinction is bourgeois in nature and should be combated with equal ferocity as racism, fascism, homophobia. Not many would argue, even on the center left, that Democrats have workers' interests in mind. Theoretically, there is agreement, but theory isn't enough. We need organizational principles of vulgar class independence. That is why Firebrand has a policy against membership in opportunist organizations. You cannot be a DSA member and a member of Firebrand. We choose vulgar class independence. We choose vulgar class independence for the influence it has on our revolutionary organizations. We want our organizations to hate the bourgeoisie in every manifestation, especially those that are most enticing to radicalizing workers. The ISO failed to foster this development and was overly focused on a business-like, emotionally approach that overly intellectualized political disagreements. Every bombed village is my hometown is the kind of attitude that our organizations need to be steeped in if we hope to win the support of our Palestinian brothers and sisters, our trans comrades, and our Black and brown community members gunned down in the streets. While there is a lower class, while there's a soul in prison, we are not free. And then the third description I had, the third characteristic, is proletarian roots. The revolutionary profession set as our task and defined by Lenin, that's my only mention of Lenin too, that's kind of like an all-time low, by Lenin must be inextricably tied to the working masses. This is what makes recruitment from any and all would-be Marxists coming to anti-capitalist conclusions all the more important, especially those who are unorganized. The task is so much easier done than said. It merely takes effort and dedication. Developing historically informed, theoretically sound political principles is of primary importance, but it means nothing if we aren't showing up to intervene. No matter the size of a revolutionary organization, attending protests, demonstrations, strike lines, marches, and yes, even at times parades, should be taken as a necessary function of the organization. Becoming a familiar face among the active left, no matter its eclecticism, is the best way to embed yourself in the advancing layer of workers, because the primary arena for working class rebellion is in social movements, not in specific workplaces. In Denver, our organizing efforts are often spurned, if not outright rejected, and sometimes explicitly opposed. We show up anyways. We are dedicated to the fight for liberation, regardless of whether or not other leftist groups like us. To be honest, we take their disdain as a badge of honor. Whether or not we have an ear to the leadership, we are present for those in attendance, regardless of the politics from the front. Our organizations must show up loud, proud, and sexy to make the kinds of Marxist interventions that movements are desperately in need of, to lead chants of revolution and not reformism, to pass out leaflets outlining our political perspective, having conversations, making relationships, and fighting tooth and nail alongside our working class siblings. And the last was anti-fascist activism. Oftentimes, anti-fascist activism is a bedrock for social movements in the streets. While we do want to maintain an accurate and historically informed definition of fascism, the nascent fascism of Proud Boys and other like men's rights activists, forced birther movements, actual neo-Nazis, pro-cop militia types, the biker fash, 2A nut jobs, and homophobic and transphobic Christian nationalists, and any other far-right wing groups that seek to violently enforce bourgeois ideology on the streets. Opposition to these kinds of would-be fascists can feel daunting and downright scary at times. Organizationally, we must take We must take the stand that allowing fascism to go unopposed is always more dangerous than opposing it. Any city with a prominent fascist presence serves as an example. We should be clear that we do not advocate for individual acts of terrorism, but rather a mass response to fascist worm trying to grow. Winning anti-fascist activists to the politics of mass orientation by showing that fighters must be thinkers and thinkers fighters is necessary to develop an organizational fabric bold in its activism, unfazed by the boogeyman touted by liberals. We stand firmly on the organizing imperative of revolution from below in all instances, no matter how bleak the position we find ourselves. We orient ourselves towards the rank and file, grassrooted masses, regardless of how bad the odds are. While this is by no means an exhaustive list, I think it is a list that addresses key organizational shortcomings on the left today and presents a blueprint for a way forward for revolutionary organizations today, no matter how small.